Are there any members wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the ayes are 56, the nays are 42. The motion to table is approved. Without objection?
And laid on the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent.
Senator from Washington.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate go into a period of morning business with the time equally divided between the minority and majority, with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, what we've seen here is a recognition that these are tough times and we need some belt tightening, but to go back to this level of sequestration is not the right thing to do, because that's taken a meat cleaver approach across the board on cutting federal programs. It's just not a responsible way of belt tightening. So fortunately, this motion to recommit to, in essence, go to the level of the appropriations for transportation and housing and urban development, that was to take it to the level of the House, which is considerably lower than what has come out of our Appropriations Committee here in the Senate. Fortunately, this motion to recommit was defeated. Why do we want to cut funding, as the House bill does, to critical areas such as air traffic control? It's dangerous. It's short-sighted. And we've been through this rodeo before. As a matter of fact, don't we remember earlier in the year that we had to fix the sequestration cuts that went into effect in the current fiscal year, which was cutting out all kinds of air traffic controllers, and the furlough of a number of them, the closure of the contract towers for the small airports? We had to reverse that. The public rose up and said this is not the right nor intelligent thing to do when it comes to the public safety. And so, in addition to compromising the safety of the traveling public, those air traffic cuts would have increased the flight delays by hours and hours and caused a lot of cancellations. And lo and behold, when the American traveling public saw that that was exactly what was happening, they rose up and they said enough. And the body politic responded. Well, here was an attempt to repeat that all over again. So if we reduce the top line of funding for this next fiscal year on this bill, we're going to be right back in the same situation where we were last spring, scrambling to keep our aviation system functioning and to keep it functioning safely, and delaying again the next generation of air traffic control, which we are desperately trying to set up. And so this House of Representatives sequestration budget, outside of aviation, it's going to mean more crumbling roads and bridges, more families unable to put a roof over their heads, and our infrastructure will continue to be falling into further disrepair. So it's our responsibility to keep our country safe and the economy moving, and thank goodness we rejected this attempt to go back to the dark ages. But we're going to have more and more of these. Now, I can tell you one other attempt that we are going to face next Tuesday in a markup in the Commerce Committee of the NASA authorization bill. Here is a bill that has never been partisan. It's not only bipartisan, it has been nonpartisan. We've never had a partisan vote on a NASA authorization bill. 3 years ago, on the NASA authorization bill that broke a lot of new ground, we passed it out of the Senate unanimously, out of the committee unanimously, out of the whole Senate unanimously. Well, I'm very sad to report to the Senate that next Tuesday we're going to have a markup of the NASA authorization bill. There's not disagreement of the balance that we have in the bill between the big rocket called the Space Launch System, its capsule, its spacecraft, Orion, what we balance against commercial rockets trying to get cargo and crew to the International Space Station. There's not a disagreement with that. There's not a disagreement with keeping up the programs on our weather satellites. All of the stuff that we put up for NOAA so that, in fact, we can predict our weather, and in hurricane season that becomes especially important. There's not a disagreement about continuing the exploration program with the robotic spacecraft to Mars and to other planets, as well as putting up a satellite in part for the Department of Defense to warn us against the solar nuclear explosions on the surface of the sun so that we can get ready to safe our satellites by the time that nuclear radiation gets to Earth. There's no disagreement on this. There's no disagreement on the future new space telescope called the James Webb Space Telescope that's going to replace the existing one when it goes on the blink, that has uncovered all of these secrets of the universe as we peer back into time on the universe. There's no disagreement on the substance of this bill. The partisan vote that's going to occur on Tuesday in the Commerce Committee is going to be because of the funding level. The bill that Senator Rockefeller and I have offered that will be voted on will be, unfortunately, a partisan vote because it takes the level of funding of the budget resolution, $18.1 billion, and the partisan vote will be because those want the sequester to apply $16.8 billion instead of $18.1, or even lower, as the House of Representatives have done, $16.6 billion. I can tell you that that little agency, NASA, can't do all of these things that I just mentioned, that there's no disagreement that we need to do. Getting humans back into space, preparing for the next major exploration with humans in the decade of the 2030s, going to the planet Mars. There's no disagreement with that. But you can't do it if you don't provide the funds now to develop the techniques, the technology, the procedures, and build our way like building blocks to ultimately where we can send humans multiples of millions of miles away from the home planet and bring them back safely. And sadly, I'm afraid we're going to have a partisan vote because of that disagreement on the level of funding. The first time ever that we're going to have that kind of vote recorded on that little agency called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And so, just like today, here we go. Now, down the road, this is going to have to be decided. And it probably will come very late in the year. It'll probably come when we come to another crisis point of having to raise the debt ceiling. It'll probably come to the point where we've got all kind of good new ideas on tax reform that will be coming out, a major tax reform coming out of the Finance Committee, that we're limping along on appropriations bills just to keep us funded, to keep the government functioning after October the 1st in the new fiscal year. And at some point, all of this is coming to a head, including What level of funding is it going to be? I hope we will start using some common sense and act accordingly. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. President. So even as I speak here at this very moment, or maybe he's wrapped up, but the President is in Jacksonville, Florida today, and he's discussing the middle class and how to get the middle class growing again in America, a very worthy topic. Unfortunately, I wish the President would do less talking and more listening, because if he listened to the middle class, and in particular those middle class Americans that either work at a small business or are the owner of a small business, he would hear that the #1 concern that many of them now have is about Obamacare. Now, recently I've made the statement that I don't believe that we should pass a short-term budget here that pays for Obamacare. And since that time, I've heard the comments of some that that is an unreasonable request. But I want to outline today just one more reason why I think it is an unreasonable request to actually fund it, because of the impact that Obamacare is having on real people, particularly those in the middle class here in the United States. I want to focus on small businesses today because they truly are the backbone of the American economy. People here throw that term around all the time, the backbone of the economy. It really is. I mean, I live within a few blocks of 8th Street, the famed Calle Ocho in Miami, Florida, where literally every business is a small business, bakeries, sandwich shops, you name it, primarily run by immigrants and here in search of the better life and the American dream. They own these small businesses. They will be impacted by changes that this law is going to have, and I want to describe some of them. Now, yesterday we had a hearing in the Small Business Committee where the administration spoke first, and basically their take on it is Obamacare is going to be good for small businesses for 2 reasons. One, because we're going to set up these health exchanges that small businesses can go to and offer health insurance to their employees on this exchange. The exchange basically is a one-stop shop. You go online, there's 8 or 10 companies theoretically, private insurers. You get to pick a plan from one of those and your employees get insured from it. And in theory, that's not a bad idea, and in a moment, however, I'll outline why that's not working out. The second thing they brag about is this tax credit that small businesses are going to be able to use. And I want to use the testimony not just of them but of small businesses yesterday to outline to you why, in fact, these things are not only not going to work, but Obamacare is going to be deeply hurtful to small businesses and to the middle class. Let's talk first about the exchanges. The exchanges are not unfolding as they're planned. Now, I asked the administration yesterday, is it going to be ready by October 1st? Are businesses who are going to be able to go on this exchange and find an insurance plan for their employees? They said they are sure that it's going to happen. But the truth is, it's not working out that way. Now, there are 17 states who have decided to go in with their own exchanges. All 17 of those states are behind schedule in one form or another. In fact, Maryland was one of the first states to embrace it. They just asked for a delay in April because they couldn't get it going on time. A recent report from the Government Accountability Office reported that all 17 states, as I said, that were building one were behind schedule, and that they were missing deadlines on 44% of the key things that they had to do. Now, here's a second problem. These exchanges only work if you have a lot of companies competing against each other. But that's not happening either. The insurers aren't flooding to offer insurances on these exchanges. Let me give you an example. There's 3 states, Washington State, New Hampshire, and North Carolina, where only one company has responded, meaning there's no competition. And that's what's supposed to drive down the rates. In another state, not a single company responded until very recently when Humana came in to save the day and actually decided to jump on board. But here's what the vice president of a consulting firm that specializes on this, it's called Avalere Health. It's Carolyn Pearson, their vice president, and she said, quote, Humana may have a difficult time building competitive networks in Mississippi, so we could see higher than average premiums in this region. Again, another reason to doubt that these exchanges are going to work and the impact it's going to have is terrible. Now, what about the tax credits? That's a great idea, right? We're giving these tax credits to small business that they can use to buy this health insurance for their employees. That's not working out either. That's not working out either. Let me give you an example. The amount of people using it, the amount of companies using it, about only 14% of companies that are eligible for the tax credit are using it. And here's why. Let me read you a quote from the tax partner, Pat Thompson, a tax partner at Picciarelli, Gilstein and Company in Providence, also the chair of the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, said, the definition of an eligible business is challenging because it's not based on the number of employees but on full-time equivalents. For companies with a lot of part-timers, that's not very transparent. went on to say that the eligibility, the way to decide whether you're qualified for this tax credit or not is so complicated that most small companies can't figure it out. In fact, the companies who would benefit the most from the tax credit are the ones that are least likely to be able to get it because they can't afford to hire a professional accounting firm to figure it out for them. Here's another one. This is from the Birmingham Business Journal. The manager at a healthcare consulting group, Warren Averett LLC, said only 20% of small businesses that they deal with even qualify for the credit. Said many businesses he worked with offered less than 50%, and bumping their coverage to meet the requirements would cost them more than the credit saved them. These are serious problems with this tax credit, not to mention that the General Accounting Office has already said that the credit is so small that it's just not enough to change the equation for these small businesses to use it. What is the bottom line? The bottom line is that two of the things that we're being told are going to help small businesses with Obamacare are not going to. One is an exchange that's relying upon there being competition among insurers. They're not signing up, folks. The other is this tax credit that is being deeply underutilized, and it's so complicated and so small that most small businesses will not benefit from it. Now, I say all that to you because yesterday we heard from a real small business owner, someone who is the epitome of what it means to be a small business in America. His name was Larry Katz. He owns some restaurants called Dot's Diner. Here's what he said. His dream was to own his own company, so he cashed his whole life insurance policy. He calculated how much credit card availability he had. He emptied his life savings, and with less than $200,000, he opened his first diner. Within 12 months, he had stopped sleeping. He was down to less than $10,000 in savings, and he considered two options, either mortgage his home or declare bankruptcy. That's what he faced, but he made it through, like many small businesses make it through in America. And today he owns 6 diners. He has 85 employees. 65 of them are full-time. Here's what he offers those employees today: paid holidays, vacation, dental, vision, term life, and health insurance. He offers to them right now. But because of how much Obamacare is going to cost him, here's what he's going to have to do. He said, I have unfortunately made the decision to quit offering coverage as soon as the employer mandate kicks in, as the penalty, while huge, is less than the costs of offering the required coverage to all of our employees. What he's basically said is that there are employees today at his business in Louisiana who have health insurance, who are happy with their health insurance, but because of Obamacare, are going to lose that health insurance. One of the promises that was made to the American people is if you are happy with your health insurance, you get to keep it. I know of at least one business in Louisiana where that's not true, and I promise you it's not limited to just this business. In fact, the evidence keeps coming in from all over the country of the impact this is going to have. I'll read you some quotes. Here's one from Texas. At Lion and Rose Pubs and at Golden Chick SA restaurants, 1,000-plus employees saw their work schedules reduced to part-time shifts. From the Wall Street Journal, Ken Adams, who's been turning to more part-time workers at his 10 Subway shops in Michigan to avoid possibly incurring higher health care costs. From the same article in the Wall Street Journal, Rod Karstensen, owner of 11 Del Taco restaurants around Denver and Colorado, began in April converting his mostly full-time workforce into one comprising mostly of part-time to help minimize the health care costs. This is the real-life impact. Interestingly, I asked the administration official yesterday, can you tell us whether anyone who has health insurance now and is happy with it will lose it? And her answer was, I can't answer that. Now, I don't know if she meant she doesn't know, or I don't know if she meant I can't tell you. But I can tell you, and small businesses will tell you, Mr. President, if you talk to them, the impact this is going to have is not only are people going to lose their health care coverage, they're going to lose their hours. They're going to get moved from full-time to part-time. Here's something. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce did a poll. 74% of small businesses plan to duck the costly law of Obamacare by either firing workers, reducing hours of full-time staff, and moving them to part-time, or not offering any coverage at all. This is the real-world impact of Obamacare that it's having on the middle class and on the working class. This is terrible for our country. This is not any longer a Republican or Democratic issue. This doesn't matter if you voted for Mitt Romney or Barack Obama. This is going to hurt everybody. There are working class people in America today who have existing insurance, who are happy with their doctor, and are going to lose all of that because of this experiment. There are people today who are struggling to make it just as it is. And they're going to lose their hours. They're going to get forced from full-time work to part-time work. That's the real-life impact of Obamacare, Mr. President. And that's the impact it's having on the working class and on the middle class. How can we go forward with this? And we have a chance to stop this. And it may be our last best chance, and it comes in September when we have to pass a short-term budget in this chamber. And if we vote for a budget that funds this, this is going to move forward and hurt people terribly. And those who vote for it are going to have to answer for that. To my Republican colleagues, I would just say this. If we're not going to draw a line in the sand on Obamacare, we have no lines in the sand. If this issue is not important enough for us to draw a line in the sand, what issue is? This is not a political issue. This is not a partisan issue. Today, I am giving this speech on behalf of the hardworking men and women of this country, working class, middle class, small business owners who are going to be terribly impacted by this law. We cannot just stand by and allow it to go further. We have to do everything we can to keep this from happening to people. And in September, we will have our last best chance to do that. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayers.
The senator from Illinois.
President, I ask consent the quorum call be suspended
Without objection.
and consent to speak in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, America has a rich history of immigration. We're a nation of immigrants. There's hardly a person in America today who doesn't have an immigrant parent, grandparent, or at least someone in their lineage who came to this country from another place. I've told this story many times on the floor. My mother was an immigrant. She came to America, brought to America at the age of 2 from Lithuania. Her son now stands in the United States Senate. That's my story, that's my family's story, but it's America's story. It can be repeated over and over and over again. We think about the Statue of Liberty and how it thrills so many people to see it for the first time, and then to understand the message of the Statue of Liberty, to lift my lamp beside that golden door, so that people are welcome to this country, and we knew it from the beginning. It was the key to our future. So many times this issue of immigration is overlooked. It's such a critical part of who we are in America. Think back in your own family history, 1 generation, 2 or 3 generations, to a person in a foreign land who said one day, "We're going to America," who undoubtedly was questioned about that decision. You're going to a place you've never been, to a place where they don't speak our language, to a place where they eat different kinds of food. This will be quite a challenge. Well, it was. And millions of people made that trip and came to this country facing that challenge, and they made us who we are today. In the DNA of most of us who live in America is some little chromosome that said there's a courage to move and a courage to come. And I think it makes us better for it. I think immigration is one of the most important parts of America. And thank goodness immigration continues, because it brings to our shores amazing people, new generations of leaders who found countries and found companies and work hard so that their children and their children's children will do better. If that is a fact about America and our history of immigration, there's also another fact. There have always been haters, people who hate immigrants. I don't know when it started. Maybe after the Mayflower landed, the folks got off and said, "Please don't send us any more." But it's been part of American history and part of American political history and part of the United States Congress. I was reading a book as we started to debate this question of immigration reform, entitled Coming to America by Roger Daniels, and it's a history of immigration in America. And they speak of a member of the House of Representatives in 1924 named Albert Johnson. He was a Republican from Washington State. I'm going to yield the floor to the senator who is chairing at this moment.
Mr. President.
The senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I really appreciate the senator from Illinois. I just wanted to let all senators know that we have made tremendous progress on the Transportation and Housing Bill. We intend to make more progress next week. We're going to stay in morning business this afternoon. We have a few issues that we are working out through the weekend. We'll be back at this next week. And I want to thank all the members who've worked really hard with us, and we will hopefully finish this soon next week.
Mr. President,
The senator from Maine.
if the senator from Illinois will yield just further, I too want to comment on the progress that we have made this week. We've been considering this appropriations bill in regular order. We've actually cleared several amendments today. We've had some votes. We've defeated an amendment to recommit the bill to committee so that we can proceed to go forward. So Senator Murray and I will be here on Monday, ready and open for business. We'll start sequencing amendments. And I hope that members on both sides of the aisle will approach this bill in a cooperative spirit, with respect for the rights of senators to offer their amendments and get votes, and that we won't see members drawing lines in the sand or deciding that they're going to block action going forward, because I think this vote and this bill, rather, could be a model of how we should operate. Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I ask consent that the important announcement from Senators Murray and Collins be placed in a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, returning to the issue of immigration, and I was happy to be interrupted because news of progress in the Senate is always worth an interruption, but I will tell you that we have had a history of debating immigration in Congress. And when I read this book on the history of immigration itself, I came up with some interesting quotes. It's 1924. Albert Johnson, the Republican from Washington State, is chairing the House Committee on Immigration. This is what he said. Today, instead of a well-knit, homogeneous citizenry, we have a body politic made up of all and every diverse element. Today, instead of a nation descended from generations of free men bred to a knowledge of the principles and practice of self-government, of liberty under the law, we have a heterogeneous population, no small proportion of which is sprung from races that throughout the centuries have known no liberty at all. In other words, Congressman Johnson said, our capacity to maintain our cherished institutions stands diluted by a stream of alien blood with all its inherited misconceptions respecting the relationships of the governing power to the governed. It is no wonder, Congressman Johnson said, therefore, that the myth of the melting pot has been discredited. The United States is our land, he said. We intend to maintain it so. The day of unalloyed welcome to all peoples, the day of indiscriminate acceptance of all races has definitely ended. End of quote. That was a statement made by a member of Congress in 1924. And you read it today and you think to yourself, how could anyone possibly be talking about racial purity in the United States of America as he did? It just draws so many terrifying parallels to a debate which happened not many years later in Europe over racial purity. But it happened, and it happened in the United States Congress. And sadly, that wasn't the end of hatred toward immigration in the United States Congress. Mr. President, 12 years ago, I introduced a bill called the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act was a response to a constituent case in my office. A young woman, a Korean woman, in Chicago called our office. She had a story to tell. She said that she had brought her daughter at the age of 2 from Korea to the United States, to Chicago, on a visitor's visa, along with her husband. And they envisioned that her husband would open a church. And they looked forward to that day, and it never happened. And her husband continued to pray for that miracle for their family, but the mother said, I had to go to work. The mother went to work in a dry cleaning establishment in Chicago. And if you've been to that wonderful city, you know that the majority of dry cleaning establishments are run by Korean families, hard-working people who work 12 hours a day and don't think twice about doing it. Well, this woman went to work, but she wasn't making much money. And her little girl, as well as the girl's brother and sister, grew up in deepest poverty. The little girl tells the story that she used to go to school, to middle school and high school, and wait to the end of the lunch hour when students were throwing away that part of the lunch they didn't eat, and she'd dig through the wastebasket to find food. That's how poor they were. But something came along in her life that made all the difference in the world. In Chicago, we have something called the Merit Music Program. A woman decided 10 or 15 years ago to leave some money, and she said, use this money to provide musical instruments to children, poor children, in public schools, as well as the lessons they need so that they can play the instruments. The Merit Music Program is an amazing success. 100% of the students who are enrolled in that Merit Music Program go to college. 100%. Well, this little girl, this Korean immigrant girl, was brought into the program and introduced at the age of 12 to a piano for the first time. She fell in love with the piano, and she started working and practicing on it. She'd stay at the Merit Music Program headquarters late into the night. They finally gave her a key because it was warm and she wanted to practice her piano. She became such an accomplished pianist by the time she was in high school. She was accepted to the Juilliard School of Music and the Manhattan Conservatory of Music. Amazing for this poor Korean girl. And when she applied and went through filling out the application, she came to the line that said nationality and citizenship, and she turned to her mother and she said, what do I put here? And her mom said, I don't know. We brought you here at the age of 2 and we never filed any papers. And the girl said, what are we going to do? And Mom said, let's call Senator Durbin. So they called our office and we checked on the law And the law in the United States is very clear and very cruel. The law in the United States said that little girl had to leave this country for 10 years and apply to come back. 10 years. She'd been brought here at the age of 2. She was only 17 or 18 at the time. Well, that's when I decided to introduce the DREAM Act. And the DREAM Act said if you were brought here as a child to the United States, if you complete high school, if you have no criminal record of any concern, and you're prepared to either enlist in our military or finish at least 2 years of college, we'll put you on a path to becoming a citizen of the United States of America. That was the DREAM Act. Introduced 12 years ago, called on the floor many different times for passage. It finally passed just a few weeks ago as part of comprehensive immigration reform. I might tell you the end of the story about this young girl. She didn't qualify for any financial assistance because she was undocumented. 2 families in Chicago and one woman who's an amazing friend of mine named Joan Harris said they'd pay for her education. She went to the Manhattan Conservatory of Music. She excelled in the piano. She played in Carnegie Hall. She married an American jazz musician and became a citizen of the United States. And now she's working on her Ph.D. in music. She just sent me her tape for her Ph.D., and she's amazing. Teresa Lee is her name. She's the first dreamer. And it's because of her that I come to the floor today. You see, Mr. President, just yesterday it was disclosed that a member of the House of Representatives, Congressman Stephen King of Iowa, spoke to the issue of the Dreamers. I don't know how many Dreamers, students who would qualify for the DREAM Act, that Congressman King has met. I have met hundreds of them. They are amazing, incredible, living their entire life in the United States undocumented, fearing deportation any minute of any day, wondering what tomorrow will bring, standing up in the classrooms of America and pledging allegiance to the only flag they have ever known, singing the only national anthem they know, and being told by so many people, you don't belong here. You're not part of this country. They are completely conflicted and worried and uncertain about their future. And they are nothing short of amazing. These young people have done things with their lives which just are incredible. They are the valedictorians of their classes in many cases. They've gone on to college and paid for it out of their pocket in many cases. I've come to the floor on 54 different occasions with color photos of these dreamers from all over the United States when they gave us the permission to disclose their identity and told their stories. And every time I've told that story about that dreamer, someone has stopped me in the hall and said, that's an amazing story about this young person who just wants to be part of the United States and its future. And so it was troubling yesterday to pick up and read the quote from Stephen King, who is a congressman from Iowa. Mr. King is no newcomer when it comes to criticizing immigration. He introduced a bill 3 or 4 weeks ago in the House of Representatives which would have removed all the federal funds that are being used now to spare these dreamers from deportation in the United States. In other words, the President has issued an executive order so the young people who are eligible for the DREAM Act can stay. He wanted to remove all the funds so they'd have to be deported immediately. He called that for a vote. It passed in the U.S. House of Representatives just a few weeks ago, overwhelmingly supported by his Republican side of the aisle. So Stephen King has a record of opposing immigration and doing it in a very forceful way. But they found a quote which he'd made, a statement he had made on the issue of the Dreamers, and that's why I come to the floor today. In an interview with Radio Iowa, Mr. King said yesterday, "It seems as though I have a few critics out there, but those who have been advocating for the DREAM Act have been trying to make it about valedictorians," King said in an interview with Radio Iowa. "I don't disagree that there are dreamers that are valedictorians, but it also would legalize those that are smuggling drugs into the United States." In his original comments, Congressman King of Iowa said, quote, "For everyone who's a valedictorian, there's another 100 out there who weigh 130 pounds, and they've got calves the size of cantaloupes because they're hauling 75 pounds of marijuana across the desert," end of quote. In his interview Tuesday evening, Congressman King doubled down on those comments, according to the Washington Post, saying, quote, "We have people that are mules, they're drug mules, that are hauling drugs across the border, and you can tell by their physical characteristics what they've been doing for months," end of quote. Mr. President, if you're going to be part of this political business, you better have a pretty tough spine and a pretty hard shell, because people throw criticism around all the time. And if you can't take it, this ain't beanbag, do something else. But I deeply resent what was said by Congressman King about these dreamers. It is totally unfair. It's mean and it's hateful. Don't take my word for it. Take the words of the Republican leaders who responded to Mr. King. House Speaker John Boehner, commenting on Congressman King's comments, called them, quote, "wrong and hateful." That's from Speaker Boehner. House Majority Leader Eric Cantor, Republican of Virginia, said they were, quote, "inexcusable," end of quote. During a House Judiciary Committee subcommittee hearing Tuesday, Representative Joseph Garcia, Democrat of Florida, described King's words as, quote, "beneath the dignity of this body." Representative Raul Labrador, Republican of Idaho, who's been heavily involved in immigration reform, expressed hope Wednesday that King regretted his remarks. Quote, "There's nobody in the conference who would say such a thing, and I hope that he, if he thought about it, he wouldn't say such a thing again," close quote, Labrador said. It is heartening to know that members of Congressman King's own political party, Republicans, have stated unequivocally how awful his statement was. It troubles me and it's heartbreaking to think that these dreamers, these young people who are simply asking for a chance to be part of the United States, would be characterized as dope smugglers and drug smugglers. Obviously, Congressman King's never read the DREAM Act, because if you've ever been convicted of a crime, you can't be approved through the DREAM Act for citizenship, not a serious crime. That's part of the law. He should know better, but I'm not sure that he cares. I'm glad that members of his own party have stepped up and branded these comments for what they are. And what I have to say to him is take a moment away from the media, meet some of these dreamers and hear their stories. Hear what they've been through and hear about what they want to do with their lives for the United States of America's future. And to the dreamers themselves, this isn't the first criticism they've run into. They've taken a lot. They're courageous young men and women. When I started this trek, this 12-year trek on the DREAM Act, I used to give speeches in Chicago about the bill, and there'd be audiences full of Hispanics usually. Nothing much would be said, and I'd go out to my car afterwards, and in the darkness, there'd be a couple students waiting by the car. And they'd call me to the side after they looked both ways to make sure no one was around, and they'd say, "Senator, we're dreamers. We're counting on you to give us a chance." Over the years, these young people who waited to greet me in the darkness when no one was around have now stepped up. They're identifying who they are so America knows what's at stake. And when you meet the dreamers, you will really realize how awful and wrong these statements are by Congressman King. There will always be critics of immigration in America. It's part of our national tradition. But I do believe the vast majority of Americans are fair people. They are people who believe in justice. They do not believe that a child should be held responsible for any wrongdoing by their parent. If their parent brought them to the United States as a baby, they had no voice in that decision. Why should they be penalized for that decision? They should be given their own chance to become part of this nation's future. I'll close by saying that maybe Teresa Lee wasn't the first dreamer in my life. My mother was brought here at the age of 2 and certainly didn't have much of a voice in the decision to come to America. But thank goodness her mother and father decided to make that trip, and that my grandparents located in Illinois and gave me a chance to grow up in a great place with a great family. That's my story, and that's America's story. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Alabama.
Senator Durbin is such an eloquent and champion for right and justice, and I'm always impressed with him. And I do agree that the American people are good and decent people. They want the right thing. They want the right thing in immigration. Part of that is a lawful system of immigration that serves the national interest of our country. And we disagree on how to get there sometimes, but you can't dispute the passion of Senator Durbin. Mr. President, I wanted to share some thoughts about the President's tour today and the last couple of days talking about jobs. Well, I've got to say, first and foremost, this country is not doing well economically. It's just not. You hear the stock market is up, and people try to translate that into substantial progress in the economy, but it's just not there, particularly with jobs. The fourth quarter of last year, our GDP growth was 0.4%. It was, by the time the first half of this year concludes, now we're not going to have 2% growth over that period. And you're not going to create jobs unless you have economic growth. And we're not seeing it. And wages are down. Wages have declined since 1999 for working Americans by virtually any calculation. Wages have been declining. Unemployment is up. The number of people working today is 2 million fewer than in 2007. We have 2 million fewer people working today than in 2007. And we have fewer people working, I believe, since 2000. This is the slowest economic recovery since the recession, since the Great Depression. There's no doubt about that. But we have done all kinds of extraordinary things. We've had the biggest stimulus, all borrowed, spent, to going to stimulate the economy and create predictive growth. Has it produced real growth? Or is it just a sugar high, as one of the Wall Street gurus referred to it? It appears quite clear it's a sugar-type high. And we have more and more plans from our leadership here in the Senate. And it's basically tax and spend. So the American people are hurting. They're not getting, their wages are falling and so forth. They have unemployment problems. And so we promised to tax more, and we're going to spread more money around and borrow more. And that this is somehow going to put us on a sound path to prosperity, job growth, wage increases, which is what we need. Please note these facts. And I don't mind the President talking about the issue. I know he's using the word middle class. Well, he should. Middle class, working Americans, struggling Americans, somebody needs to be thinking about them. But you also have to have policies. And a speech is not a policy. A speech is not tangible that creates growth, jobs, and prosperity and increased wages. GDP growth last quarter was only 1.8% and has averaged at or under 2% since the end of the recession in 2009. There's a major corporation CEO, which is common throughout the business, but he just said, quite frankly, we're not hiring anybody if the GDP growth in America is not over 2%. Well, we hadn't had 2% growth. We've hardly had it since 2009. He actually is not filling vacancies still, even though we have a modest growth, and people are trying to oversell that. I'm just saying the economy is struggling. It's not growing rapidly enough to create jobs, and we have record unemployment. The Wall Street Journal's panel of economic experts expect slow growth for the rest of this year at 2% or less. They've revised their forecast down. The President, the Congressional Budget Office, just a year or so ago, were predicting higher numbers than this, and they're not coming in. Now they're revising downward what they expect the economy to do in the second half of the year. We need more than a speech, in my opinion. after 6 years since the beginning of the recession, we still have not created as many jobs as existed in December of 2007. Americans are working 5 billion fewer hours than in 2007. Think about that. 5 billion fewer hours than in 2007. And some say, well, our immigration plan, recalls my attention to it, is somehow going to fix that. We bring in more workers and everybody's going to get pay raises and unemployment is going to be reduced. But that's not what the Congressional Budget Office told us at a time that we're struggling to find jobs for American workers. Many of them themselves unemployed are immigrants to the country, African Americans, poor people struggling to get by. And you continue to bring in a larger flow of labor than the country can absorb. As Mr. Peter Kirsanow at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights said, we don't have a shortage. We don't have a shortage of workers in America. We have an excess of workers in America. We got more workers than we've got jobs. Americans and the fastest growing type of work today is part-time employment. Over 320,000 part-time jobs were created last month compared to 195,000 full-time jobs. They're counting these part-time employment jobs as employment. But it's not good. It's better than nothing, I suppose, but we're having a surge of part-time employment driven in large measure by the President's health care policies. It just is. Everybody knows that. New unemployment claims came out this week are up. In other words, the number of people who are filing for unemployment insurance, it's gone up. I hate to say, 7,000 more in July to 343,000. The average net worth of American households, get this, someone said recently net worth was back to nearly what it was, and that was something we'd heard based on, I guess, the stock market primarily. But another analysis looked at it and said, well, what about the share of the debt of America that's increased dramatically since since 2007. Well, once you calculate the debt that all of us owe as American citizens to the total debt of America, their household net worth is 60% lower than it was in 2007. So I guess what I would say, Mr. President, is it's time for this nation to begin a serious discussion about what it is that's causing our economy to slide and what it is we can do realistically to create jobs, growth, higher wages, and so forth. One of the things you should do is not bring in more labor than we have jobs for. That's pretty simple to me. One of the things we should do is try to bring down the cost of energy, not increase the cost of energy. One of the things we should do is eliminate the unnecessary regulations that drive up cost and produce nothing but a burden in exchange. We need a tax system that favors growth. We need to defend on the world stage the legitimate interests of America and our working people. We've not effectively fought back against unfair trade, and we can do a better job of that. There are just lots of things we can do that don't revolve around taxing more, borrowing more, and spending more. That's what the policy is here. We have a bill that just busts the budget wide open on the floor right now. I mean, we agreed to these limits 2 years ago. Senator Shelby, the ranking Republican on the Budget Committee, he stood firm for the agreement levels that we've agreed to. And it's not easy, but we agreed to it. But, oh, no, the majority has got to spend more than the amount that's currently limited by law. So I guess what I would say, Mr. President, is that President Obama is correct to at least talk about this issue, but we need to do more than talk. And about all we're hearing when the President talks is plans to invest more, to spend more, and to tax more, and to borrow more. That will not change the debt course of America. We need real policies that put us on a path to prosperity, that protect the American worker from unfair foreign competition, from excessive labor brought into the country, and too much energy cost, too high an energy cost, and a lot of other things that we can do that would promote prosperity in the country. I thank the chair and will yield the floor.
Senator from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as we all know, we have a jobs crisis in America. High unemployment and weak economic growth have festered for nearly 5 years. American families are increasingly dependent upon government, and businesses are being suffocated by it all over this country. I believe, Mr. President, that our ability to emerge from this job crisis stronger than before depends upon government performing its proper role in the economy. In my view, that role is to establish the conditions for job creation and economic growth in the private sector. Through stable fiscal policy, a simplified tax code, and streamlined regulation, the government can create an economic environment conducive to risk-taking and innovation that lead to real job creation in this country. Unfortunately, the same toxic combination of government overreach and inaction that has failed to produce a jobs recovery in this country thus far also threatens to prolong the job crisis, I believe, for years to come. Now, Mr. President, we learn in the last few days that President Obama is planning a PR blitz to gloss over his failed economic agenda. Over a series of speeches that he will give around the country, he said he would discuss his vision for the future, but he will offer nothing new. According to the New York Times, his jobs plan is, quote, largely repackaged economic proposals that the President has offered for years. Mr. President, we need a fresh, free market approach to job creation. Stale Obama policy leftovers just won't cut it. It's not new ideas. It's not a new beginning. The current situation, Mr. President. I will preface my remarks here on the fiscal, tax, regulatory, and monetary policy challenges that we face in this country with a more detailed description of the current macroeconomic conditions, starting with job numbers. The official unemployment rate, Mr. President, in the U.S. is 7.6%. That makes 54 straight months of unemployment above 7.5%. However, Mr. President, as grim as those figures are, they do not tell the full story. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that the real unemployment rate in this country, known as U6, is 14.3% unemployment. U6 includes those who are unemployed, those who want to work but have stopped searching for a job, and those working part-time because they cannot find full-time work. Mr. President, 22.6 million Americans fall under this category that I've just described. That's the real unemployment, and that's sad. The real unemployment rate was 14.2% when President Obama took office in January of 2009. It peaked at 17.1% in late 2009 and early 2010. but has not fallen below 13.8% during his time in office. Mr. President, by all measures, this has been a jobless presidency thus far. And digging further into the numbers reveals more troubling trends. The number of people working part-time because their hours were cut back or because they cannot find full-time work increased by 322,000 people last month to 8.2 million people in this country. The percentage of the unemployed who have been without work for 27 weeks, Mr. President, or more also remains dangerously high at 36.7%. An analysis by the Hamilton Project in February of this year found that we will not get back to full employment for another 10 years based on recent job creation numbers. Meanwhile, economic growth remains sluggish. The most recent figures from the Bureau of Economic Analysis indicate that the U.S. real gross domestic product, GDP, grew at a tepid 1.8% annual rate in the first quarter of 2013, this year. Average annual GDP growth was just over 0.8% over President Obama's first term in office, the full 4 years. Mr. President, we're experiencing the weakest economic recovery since the Great Depression. And as a consequence, government dependency in this country is on the rise. Under President Obama, the number of Americans on food stamps has increased by 47% to 47 million people. 8.9 million Americans collect disability pay, and that number is increasing by 70,000 people a month, unheard of in the past. These are alarming figures. So, Mr. President, how did we get there? I will explain. Overspending. The current job crisis, I believe, is a product of the 2008 financial meltdown that we all went through. No one denies that President Obama was dealt a tough hand coming into office. He was. But the question is, what did he do about it? President Obama's first act in office, you'll recall, Mr. President, was to ram through a $787 billion stimulus package through Congress. He promised the American people that it would keep the unemployment rate from rising above 8%. Instead, the unemployment rate hit 10% in October of 2009 and remained above 8% for the next 43 consecutive months, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But President Obama's spending binge was just getting started. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the budget deficit in 2009 was $1.413 trillion. In 2010, it was $1.294 trillion. In 2011, another $1.3 trillion. 2012, $1.087 trillion, not billion, trillion. And although the 2013 deficit we're in now is projected to dip below $1 trillion, it will still be $183 billion higher than any pre-Obama deficit. Mr. President, looking at the big picture, the national public debt now stands at just under $17 trillion, an increase of 60% under President Obama. What has been the result of this spending spree, Mr. President? Taxpayers got more debt, but job seekers didn't get work. Compounding our fiscal difficulties, Social Security and Medicare remain on unstable long-term footing. These programs alone already account for 38% of federal spending. But over the next 25 years, the Congressional Budget Office projects that their share, that is Social Security and Medicare, of GDP to increase by 40%. According to the trustees of the Social Security and Medicare trust funds, Medicare is expected to run out of money in 13 years, and Social Security will go broke by 2033. Saving these essential programs requires presidential leadership. Unfortunately, there's been none to speak of. President Obama's spending binges have precipitated multiple budget showdowns, and as a result, Mr. President, they've also presented many opportunities for spending and entitlement reform. But President Obama has not risen to the occasion yet. Despite broad consensus that we must take action to save Social Security and Medicare, President Obama used the power of his office to campaign pre- and post-election for one thing: tax increases. Mr. President, tax increases are not the solution to a spending problem. Tax hikes do not create jobs. Tax hikes will not generate growth. Tax hikes kill jobs and allow President Obama to spend more, and for Congress and the President to borrow more. Mr. President, I believe what we need in this country is structural tax reform, not tax increases. According to the most recent data from the Internal Revenue Service, the top 1% of taxpayers, those making $369,000 or more, pays 37.38% of all income taxes. I want to say it again. According to the IRS, 1% of the taxpayers pay 37% of all income taxes. The top 5% of taxpayers, those making $161,000 or more, pay 59% of all income taxes. Think about it. The top 10% of all taxpayers, those making $116,000 or more, pay 70% of all income taxes. The top 25% of taxpayers, those making $69,000 or more, pay 87% of all income tax. And the top 50% of taxpayers, those making $34,000 or more, pay 97% of all income taxes. Meanwhile, the other 50%, those making $34,000 or less, pay 2.36%, a little over, not quite 2.5% of all income taxes. In addition, approximately half of U.S. households pay no income tax. And despite these imbalances, Mr. President, President Obama increased taxes on the wealthiest Americans by $617 billion in January of this year. Still, a Heritage Foundation analysis of Treasury Department data finds that President Obama's fiscal year 2014 budget contains an additional $1.1 trillion in proposed tax increases. This is a tax and spend administration. The size and complexity of the tax code adds to the tax burden on the economy. The code contains 55,600 pages, I'm told. Taking into account all explanatory materials and IRS rulings, the Standard Federal Tax Reporter comprises 70,000 pages. Mr. President, even the easiest tax form, the 1040-EZ, runs 46 pages. The total cost of complying with the individual and corporate tax requirement in this country was $168 billion last year. And according to the IRS Taxpayer Advocate, there has been approximately 4,680 changes to the tax code since 2001. The tax code, Mr. President, is filled with various credits, deductions, and corporate welfare. Analysis by the Joint Committee on Taxation finds that these so-called tax expenditures total $1.3 trillion. We could drastically simplify the tax code and lower individuals' rates by eliminating these provisions alone. Unfortunately, President Obama's approach to taxes is the same as his approach to spending. More, more, more. But no structural reforms that would help establish the conditions for job creation and economic growth in this country, which we desperately need. Mr. President, overregulation of the economy further deteriorates the conditions necessary for job creation and economic growth. The aggregate regulatory burden on American families and businesses is staggering. A study by the Competitive Enterprise Institute estimates that total costs for Americans to comply with federal regulations reached $1.806 trillion in 2012. This translates to nearly $15,000 per family, or 23% of average household income. According to the American Action Forum, the federal government so far this year alone has published regulations that will result in $61 billion in compliance costs and 80 million hours of paperwork burden. Despite the failure of the stimulus package, President Obama put the unemployed on hold for more than a year while he forced government-run health care through Congress. He promised his plan would reduce health insurance premiums by $2,500. Instead, premiums have already increased by that amount, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation Employee Health Benefit Survey. A recent Wall Street Journal analysis, Mr. President, finds that premiums could double or even triple for healthy consumers even under Obamacare. Altogether, Obamacare is 2,400 pages long and creates 159 new boards, commissions, and government offices. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, the 10-year spending estimate for Obamacare is $1.88 trillion. Analysis by the Joint Committee on Taxation shows that the law creates or raises 21 taxes totaling $1.1 trillion over the next 10 years. Mr. President, the impact of Obamacare on hiring is not surprising. According to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's second quarter 2013 small business survey, 71% of small businesses say the health care law makes it harder to hire people. The same survey finds that one-half of small businesses say they will either cut hours to reduce full-time employees or replace full-time employees with part-time workers to avoid the mandate. In addition, Gallup finds that 41% of small business owners say they have held off on hiring new employees in response to Obamacare. Mr. President, I welcome recent news that the Obama administration will temporarily delay the employer mandate. But in light of the evidence that Obamacare is increasing health insurance costs and making it harder for the unemployed to find jobs, we should delay the whole law permanently for everyone. We should repeal it. Congress should start over and craft legislation that will actually lower health care costs and preserve high-quality care without crushing businesses with unnecessary regulations. President Obama's expansion of government did not end with Obamacare. Mr. President, in 2010, he forced through Congress his purported response to the financial meltdown, the Dodd-Frank legislation. We were told that the financial regulatory system needed to be streamlined to prevent future bailouts, and that's true. Instead, Dodd-Frank created more government agencies than it eliminated. Moreover, the law totals more than 2,300 pages and calls for 400 new rules. A study, Mr. President, by scholars at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University estimate that Dodd-Frank had already generated 2,109 restrictions in the Code of Federal Regulations by the end of 2011, and it's more to come. At this rate, they project a 26% increase in restrictions in relevant section of the code once all of Dodd-Frank rulemakings are finalized in the future. Mr. President, Dodd-Frank will create jobs only for regulatory compliance officers, not for people working every day in the United States. Earlier this year, Mr. President, I introduced legislation that would require regulators to perform rigorous cost-benefit analysis of new Dodd-Frank regulations. Under the legislation, a regulation dies if its costs exceed its benefits to the economy. Unfortunately, the Democratic majority here in the Senate has not brought this legislation up for consideration. Some observers have subscribed to the cynical view that the legislation is nothing more than an effort to undercut financial reform. Mr. President, I'm the only current member of the Senate who voted against both financial deregulation in 1999 and the Wall Street bailout in 2008. I subscribe to the view that regulation should protect taxpayers without harming job creators. President Obama's regulatory zeal finds an outlet now in a war on coal in this country. Aware that he does not have the votes to jam his carbon tax agenda through Congress, he now will direct the Environmental Protection Agency to implement it by way of regulation. We all know his environmentalist crusade will kill jobs. An analysis by the Heritage Foundation estimates that drastically reducing the percentage of coal in our nation's energy portfolio would, by 2030, kill more than 500,000 jobs and increase electricity prices by 20%. In contrast, a Wood-McKenzie study estimates that 1.4 million American jobs could be created if the government adopted policies encouraging U.S. energy exploration and production. Mr. President, I believe that the Obama environmental agenda will do more to put family budgets in the red than it will to make the world green. Instead of waging a war on coal jobs, I believe President Obama should approve and expedite the Keystone Pipeline. This would create tens of thousands of jobs and decrease energy bills for families and businesses. Mr. President, this is the type of clear-headed energy policy we should be pursuing in this country. But in light of the existing and increasing regulatory burden, it's not surprising that the Federal Reserve estimates that manufacturers, domestic producers, and other non-financial American companies are sitting on a record $1.78 trillion stockpile of cash. Why? If we're to create the conditions for real job creation in this country, we must start by streamlining the regulatory burden on the economy. The rules, restrictions, and mandates facing those who wish to undertake an entrepreneurial endeavor or expand their businesses through investment and innovation is mind-numbing. I would also like to talk a few minutes on monetary policy. Very dry, complicated, but very important to all of us. On July the 13th, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke told members of the House Financial Services Committee, quote, "If we were to tighten policy, the economy would tank." What does he mean? He was referring to the Federal Reserve's aggressive use of non-traditional monetary policy to prop up markets since the financial meltdown of 2008. The implied message is striking. The Fed is taking big risks through monetary policy because administration policy is not helping the economy. The Federal Reserve, Mr. President's balance sheet quantifies just how big of a risk Chairman Bernanke feels he must take with so-called monetary stimulus. It currently stands, the Fed balance sheet stands at $3.5 trillion and continues to grow at $85 billion a month, under the Fed's so-called quantitative easing program. Among the assets included in the Fed's balance sheet are $2 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities and $1.2 trillion in federal agency mortgage-backed securities. But to put the acceleration of the Fed's balance sheet into perspective, it took 95 years, Mr. President, from the Fed's creation 100 years ago, 1913, to reach $1 trillion. The Fed then added the second trillion in just 6 weeks, followed by the third trillion this past January. Under the current quantitative easing programs, the Fed's balance sheet will reach $4 trillion in less than 6 months. Where does it end? 5 trillion, 6 trillion, 10 trillion? As with fiscal policy, Mr. President, we are in uncharted monetary policy waters. The Fed's unprecedented measures carry substantial risk and uncertainty to every man, woman, and child in this country. Should inflation increase, and it will, the Fed would have to tighten monetary policy to contain it. However, should the Fed tighten monetary policy, it risks stalling an already weak economy here. And as deep as our fundamental economic challenges already are, the thought that one wrong monetary policy move by the Fed could cripple our entire economy is deeply troubling. In conclusion, Mr. President, I think we face a serious confluence of economic challenges in this country. It's obvious to me that President Obama's policies have not worked and that they will not create work or jobs. Mr. President, real job creation is a result of entrepreneurship and innovation and risk in the free market. I believe that the government's role is to establish conditions for that to occur. We can do this by stabilizing our nation's finances, simplifying our tax code, and streamlining our regulatory framework. The more President Obama and this administration clings to the tired liberal ideology that more government is always the answer, the longer this job crisis will persist. America deserves better. Thank you, Mr. President.